Out on a Limb is more than a collection of pieces. It's a history of the last 30 years that lays out a roadmap, I think, for how we got here to this fragile, imperiled state of democracy. And when you read it now in total, starting with 1989, in retrospect, you see the roadmap. And so, Andrew, thank you for being here. Let's begin with hearing you state the problem. How bad are things, and what is the precise nature of the American crisis?
Well, I think that it's a crisis of liberalism. I think that the Constitution that we have was set up with some assumptions that are really central to the Enlightenment, which is that we would be able, as citizens in a republic, to take on that role and deliberate reasonably together about the common good. And that is how the democracy can work. They would divide power with the assumption that we would eventually be able to compromise, that we would come to some kind of resolution. What they didn't foresee was, first of all, obviously political parties, but much more importantly, I don't think they foresaw the tribal nature of the future that's happened, I think, particularly in the 21st century in ways that took us by surprise. I wrote a piece, which is in the book, America Wasn't Made for Humans, which is really about what happens when tribalism takes over. And I think the key thing to understand really is less why are we in trouble, than how do we last so long? Because in the history of the world, tribal politics is politics. It's all it ever was, one tribe against another. It's only been the last few hundred years in Europe and North America that a different model came, which depended upon reason, not passion, citizenship rather than tribal identity membership, and constitutional democracy, which allowed us to elect governments and parliaments and congresses in order to hash out as reasonable people what we wanted to compromise on. Now, when you remove that from the system, when it's only tribal emotion, you can't ever compromise because your very identity is at stake. And if you can't compromise, you can't get anything done. So what's happened, the Congress is basically deadlocked into nothingness at this point. I mean, it can just about manage one or two massive omnibus bills twice a year, if it's lucky. Most of the decisions are now made by the president and the extraordinarily growing powers of that presidency under both parties. And that's why we're stuck. And then social media came along to put force and irrationality and passion on steroids in our civic conversation to make it even harder for us to talk and compromise and deliberate together, even as citizens outside of politics, just in terms of our talking together, our writing, our thinking, our exchanging of views. It is degenerating into tribalism, and tribalism will eventually degenerate either into some kind of civil conflict or some authoritarian figure who will attempt to force some kind of unity. And that's my concern.
Yeah. In some ways, we're lucky that Trump was such an idiot, right? Because a smart authoritarian figure could have succeeded in the division.
Yes, I mean, I spent today reading the Woodward book, Peril. What we discovered with the Trump, we had 2 out of 3. We had the power hunger, which everyone has, then the absolute madness that not everyone has, but also basically a desire, if power is to be taken away from him, to actually rig the system or use his powers as president to keep himself in power. That if he had been halfway competent, it would have happened. There were people willing to do, we discovered, like this man, John Eastman, we just discovered this memo, extraordinary memo, arguing for basically the end of a transfer of power based on nothing but one man vice president's assertion. Really, it's amazing how far we've come. Now, it didn't work, which is a relief. partly because it couldn't have worked the way it was set out, and partly because Mike Pence was able to say, don't be ridiculous, we're not doing this. But at some point, that's not going to happen unless we begin to ratchet this whole thing back, in which we not just accept a president of the other party, but hope he or she will succeed. That's where we have to get to.
Well, when I said that the book is sort of a roadmap for how we got here, one of the things that spoke to me was a 2009 column, the headline of which, Republican Taliban declared jihad on Obama. It's tempting to like look back in the past as if it was more kumbaya, but you put in that piece, you put your finger on, you were very prescient and put your finger on what was about to happen, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see Obama in that context, because if you also read the piece, Why Obama Matters, it's really an argument that Obama represents the possibility of overcoming this tribal divide, because he is both black and white. He is not of the 60s generation, which was so torn apart over this stuff, that he was temperamentally very pragmatic, that he would love to cooperate with Republicans, that he inherited an incredible economic crisis, probably the worst since the Great Depression. Surely in those circumstances, with that amount at stake, with that kind of president, with that kind of mandate, Republicans would have been happy to have something constructive to do with him. And he got not a single Republican vote for the bailout, for the spending package, the stimulus package, at an incredibly dangerous time. So that's, I think Obama was a hope we could transcend it, and you can see that in my hopes, and then you can watch it collapse into Hillary, essentially, and then Trump. Yeah, and in some ways, yes, Trump is the repudiation of Obama, in as much as it's also the triumph of tribalism over the attempt, I think, of a very decent, moderate president to resist it.
So feel free to tell me I was naive. After Trump won, for a minute there, I felt hopeful. I remember back in the early 90s reading Etzioni at George Washington, the Communitarianism was all the rage, right? That informed Bill Clinton's platform, right? Yes, we guarantee rights, but responsibilities go along with that. And I thought that there could be an opening for a communitarian philosophy to take hold of our politics. The problem is really that prevents that, it seems to me, is not in the average American's makeup, but in the systemic issues with our electoral system. The fact that the only thing that matters now are primaries. Or was I being? Am I being naive to think that we could have a sort of communitarian middle?
No, I think theoretically we could. I think actually, if you were to kind of take partisanship out of it, most people would come in this country to some kind of recognition. I always think of Obamacare, which if you took Obamacare off it and you just explained it to Republicans and you said, this is a compromise between the private and the public sectors, championed by Mitt Romney, surely that would work. And it would work. And it did work, actually. And it's still working and it's still operating. So it's a sign of an issue that did get resolved for the better, but that's not the atmosphere in which it was originally discussed.
So let's get back to the problem facing America right now, which is what you have described as the war on truth. How bad is it? And give me some examples where you think we've gone the wrong way.
Well, obviously the most powerful example is the inability for us to believe that, at least a large number of people, to believe that the last election was fairly decided. That's many people always had objections to elections and afterwards said they were fraudulent or something went wrong. But this amount of belief that the system itself is flawed when the actual objective truth of this has been established clearly in the light of day, certified, gone over, examined, it's right there. There is no doubt. And yet people will not believe it. When you have tribalism to such a degree that in an epidemic that's killed now as many Americans as died in the Spanish flu in 1918, even then, we couldn't agree on very simple steps in public health that would protect all of us. If you can tribalize that issue, you can tribalize anything because it's literally life or death. What you're seeing in some cases, because this is the rationale for not getting vaccinated, people willing to die rather than concede a point to the other tribe. I mean, that is a form of war. If people are prepared to put their lives at risk in the tribal fight, that's a level of commitment that is extremely hard to ratchet down. That's my concern.
What did you mean by we're all on campus now?
Well, here's simply what I mean. That there are sort of two views of the world, and one is the one I'm talking about, which is that we're citizens debating as individuals in communities, coming to conclusions. And then there is the notion that in fact, that's not what's happening in society. What's happening in society is the result of powerful systemic forces that are organized around identity and which are the real government of our time and the real truth about our interactions and the power structures in this country. And in fact, all that other stuff about being citizens and debating and talking, having a constitution, all that stuff, all of that is simply a mask, a camouflage to hide the fact that this is all about the suppression and oppression of non-white people by white people. Now, those are two very different views of the world. One of them is rooted in a certain kind of post-war neo-Marxism in some ways. It's glommed onto whole different other intellectual traditions as it has gone along. And it's become endemic and extraordinarily hegemonic as a view in the universities. And we would make fun of it a lot of the time back then. Oh, these people are crazy. They're having these new names for things and words for things and pronouns. And there are speech codes, and you have to have trigger warnings, and any speech that might harm somebody's or hurt someone's feelings has to be taken as seriously as if there was actual violence, and so on and so forth. And yet, within a remarkable few number of years, that climate on campus is now everywhere. If you apply for a job at a major corporation, you may well have to go through a training session, which is rooted in the notion that individuals don't count, that races and group membership are much more important, that power structures you think exist are lies. Now, if that is being taught as a condition of being employed, we're all essentially on campus. So many of these notions that have come in and swept the country, especially after the murder of George Floyd last summer, these all come from that point of view. Now, look, that point of view has some cogency to it. I think it has a kernel of truth in it, but I think its belief that it's the only truth and that its truth has to supplant everyone else's is deeply corrosive of liberal society. It's as corrosive of it as the authoritarian cult fashion on the right, which is, I think, more dangerous directly, but long-term, actually, the other stuff is more corrosive of the very values we require for this system to work.
Well, you and I would say John McWhorter have been two of the most articulate critics of critical race theory. And I just want to make sure, when you talk about critical race theory, you're not critiquing the legal theory that I never read Derek Bell. That was in the 80s. What you're really talking about is what that's been perverted into, which is read White Fragility recently and thought, first of all, I thought it was terribly written, just as a from a literary standpoint. And she lost me when she says that we should no longer say that Jackie Robinson broke the color line in baseball. We should say he's the player who the white power structure allowed to break the color line. And I felt that sort of robs Jackie Robinson of agency, but also puts Branch Rickey, the white liberal, in the same boat as neo-Nazis. So I just thought it was sloppy thinking. And is that in line with your argument, or are you critiquing critical race theory, which from my understanding is we need to look at the way discrimination has been codified into law?
Well, with all due respect, I do take issue with Derek Bell. I do. I do think, for example, that discrimination without intent is close to meaningless. I do think that liberalism demands a civic equality, but cannot and explicitly does not command equality of outcome. And the failure of the equality of outcome may have many, many different causes: social, political, cultural, and so on. But that's not what liberalism is about. But that is what the leftism of critical race theory really is about: subverting liberal procedures in order to impose substantive equality of outcome. That's what they mean by equity. And if they have to discriminate against people to do so, they will do so, because they believe that's the core structure. Now, today, yes, there are many, many different offshoots of that particular idea, or that particular stream of thought, and they have been popularized in crude pop cultural, pop psychological ways. And I think that White Fragility is a classic of that pop psychology range. Essentially, my issue with it is that how would you disprove it? If they're arguing that, yes, we can see all sorts of things causing, for example, racial inequality, but in fact, it's this hegemonic concept of white supremacy that is driving it. All the others, that's the real force. And I would say, well, how do you prove that? And they just say, well, it is. And they really, and then they will point to the different other factors and call them all white supremacy. And I would say something, no, these other factors are important. I'm sure systemic racism, by which one means something like the redlining impact, or the fact that the GI Bill did not distribute its goods, that is absolutely valid. And we should attempt to undo that, but not to undo liberal society in the process. So that's what I'd say. And the other thing about some of it is, just as you can't really get them to disprove it or prove it, you also are always guilty. I mean, white fragility, the whole concept of it is that when you're told that you're exhibiting white fragility and you say, no, I'm not, they say, well, that proves that you are actually fragile and a white person. And you say, well, how could I disprove that? And the answer is, you can't. This is a way of simply rigging the argument and rendering people guilty before they even open their mouths, and basing all that on someone's involuntary characteristics. This is a very dangerous path.
It reminds me of your old friend Christopher Hitchens once said that when he was covering, I want to say, going to Czechoslovakia and to write about upheaval there, and he made a pledge to himself that he would not use the word Kafkaesque. And then the first day he was there, someone, oh no, it was actually Cuba. Someone said, we hold your passport for you. And he was like, well, I don't want to be separated from my passport. And they said, no, we hold your passport for you. And he said, they are making me say the word I don't want to say in my writing.
Yeah, I think the compelling of certain speech, the replacement of certain words. I mean, let's just be honest. The phrase white supremacy, for the vast majority of people, until the day before yesterday, essentially, we thought of it as members of the Ku Klux Klan, people who believed in the literal supremacy of the white race over others and the right to rule, the Nazis, apartheid, We didn't think that it meant American capitalism. We didn't think it meant the nuclear family. We didn't think it meant even the resilience of racial inequality. And yet that's the term used. Again, they're making us use a term which is grotesquely hyperbolic for the situation we're dealing with, but they make you say it. And if you look at mentions of the white supremacy in that meaning, they just simply were nowhere until that 2016, 2015, when suddenly they rocket. This is language being fed to you to deny you the clarity of your own arguments and your own ideas. It's forcing of language to rig the landscape so that any counter argument is always associated with people with pointy white hats, and that's just incredibly unfair play.
I agree with you. I want to make sure that, because you glossed over in a sentence or two the legitimacy of redlining concerns, but there are systemic things that we need to look at, and I think you would agree, right, that here in Philadelphia, the life expectancy for someone who lives in the posh Society Hill is 84, and just 2 miles away in Strawberry Mansion, it's 62, and that life expectancy differential breaks down wholly on race. That's a clearly an outcome that is relative to that is related to race and racial differences, and you're not saying that's not an outcome that we need to rectify.
Insofar as these things are affected and have been created by the historical legacy of these discriminatory rules and laws, which were actively imposed by governments intent on discriminating, then yes, it absolutely exists. We do need to focus on it. Does it explain everything about that? Does it account for example, crime levels? Does it account for diet? Does it account for family structure? It's complicated. And what this does, first of all, is deny any African Americans agency in constructing their own future and their own present. It treats people as if they're completely helpless in the face of the system. And it doesn't tell us specifically how we can really help. How can we reduce crime so that it isn't terrifying to live and traumatizing just to grow up in those places? How do we shift resources so we can make those schools better? What are the kind of schools we can do? How can we make that better? How can we encourage the parents of children to stick together? Because we know that that's incredibly important for the future prospects of the kid. How can we support that? Is it more childcare? Is it tighter rules on childcare payments? Is it some way we can affect these fundamental things that these fundamental complicating factors that matter? If it's just white supremacy, then it's really just the only answer is somehow revolution, and there is no actual constructive liberal measures to counter the differing things.
Yeah, I'm jumping around here, but you were nominated for a Pulitzer a few years ago, and then in short order, summarily fired by New York Magazine. And I thought that was a harbinger of things to come. Shortly thereafter, the New York Times publishes an op-ed by a sitting United States senator, and the mere publishing of that op-ed gets the editor of the op-ed page fired. Talk about what that experience was like for you. That must have been Kafkaesque. And what is this moment about? Are newsrooms becoming the next front?
Oh, the newsrooms are over. I mean, they are completely run now by people whose view of the world is that it's entirely a function of systemic injustices caused by oppressive identity groups against other oppressive identity groups. It's very hard to find anyone there who would disavow that. And that's partly because I think that at some point the media was doing terribly in the mid-2010s before Trump saved them, essentially. And part of their panic with the internet was they needed to get more clicks, they needed to get more engagement online. So they hired a whole bunch of young, straight out of college, straight out of elite college kids, essentially. They were very cheap. They were a great way to boost your online presence, but they shifted the whole balance and brought within that earnestness that you only have like the year after you leave college. and if you objected to them, you were called a racist or a sexist or worse. And then there would be digging through your journalism for something you might have said 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago to get you fired. Or there would be a scouring of people's tweets. I mean, all this stuff changed the atmosphere from being one in which you are free to say anything. And in fact, newspapers and universities, for that matter, they're the places that are supposed to be the freest for us to debate stuff. They really are. And I remember the first newspaper room I went into, which was a Daily Telegraph. I mean, these people were, first of all, they were much more working class than today's elite. There were many more reporters who were from their actual neighborhoods, who knew what they were talking about. In England, we talk about class, but in America, that would also be people who knew the Irish cops, or people who would know people on in the projects because they had family there, friends. It was much more diverse in that way, and they were fearless. There was the worst jokes, the nastiest comments, and then all made better by dropping into the pub afterwards and getting completely shit-faced. I mean, that was the atmosphere. And you walk into it today and it's like you've entered a monastery. It's total silence, and everybody's just monitoring everybody else in the Slack channel. It's just, I mean, it would drive me nuts to be a journalist, a hack, a writer, a thinker. And I found increasingly, like my editors were great to me, but they were put under increasingly difficult pressure from social media and from junior staffers, that my kind of politics, which was very anti-Trump, I mean, I was strictly anti-Trump. As a conservative, I have lots of pretty liberal positions. I mean, like, I'm very much in favor of a carbon tax. I really believe in environmental policy, for example. I'm happy to raise taxes on the wealthy, given how the economy has transformed. I mean, there are many issues in which I'm totally open to liberal positions. So I'm not Sean Hannity, but in the end, writing the stuff that I was writing, which was not against, for example, drawing attention to police abuse, but was definitely opposed to rioting and looting and violence in the streets as something that was indefensible. That, I think, but at some point it became true that, and the editors understood this, that the other people with this worldview really believed that simply my being published in the same context as them harmed them, rendered their work environment hostile, and was oppressing and harming them. And I had to get out the way. Now, I wasn't even in the office with them. I lived remotely. I'm bashing my pieces out in a small little room in Washington, D.C. But that's the way the atmosphere evolved. And you saw that coming through with the BLM movement, the Me Too movement. And then, of course, all of that became supercharged by Trump, because Trump personified everything that many of these groups had believed was the ultimate enemy. He made it seem as if white supremacy really was as powerful as they said it was. He was proof. Obama confounded them because Obama represented an alternative view of a more integrated and moderate and liberal country. And the victory of Trump persuaded them that actually there was all a delusion. It was war, race war, essentially, and war against fascism. And this just, over those years, grew with intensity and fervor. And that's where we're at. Now, look, this happens in America. It's happened in the past. It's a country that has incredibly free speech in many ways. And look, my actual free speech has not been curtailed, just the platforms I can use by private actors, not the government. So that's still true. This country, you know, this country was born in the witch trials of Salem. It had the Scarlet Letter. It had the Hollywood blacklist. It had the Lavender Scare. It has these moral panics all the time. It was a country, one has to remember, that actually put banning of alcohol in its constitution. I mean, that is probably the craziest thing any country could ever do. And you all did it very quickly. And I'm not far away from where the Puritans landed and where people brought bootleg liquor in. And that's America. So my hope is that some of this, because a lot of it is massively overstated, that the conclusions are way ahead of the evidence, and the argument is so crude. It's so crude. It requires a kind of hysteria to sustain itself, and I don't think that can happen. So I'm relatively optimistic that if we just soldier on and we keep manifesting and actually practicing liberalism, which means things like this, talking openly, taking criticism, debating things, then we will slowly regain it. It's going to be a hard slog. But I think the only way to save liberal society is to actually enact it. No one's stopping us. No one's stopping us from having difficult conversations. No one's stopping us from having debates. No one's stopping us from writing reasonably for the other side. That's the answer. As I said before, I don't think the American political system is broken. I think we are. I think the people are broken. We've lost a sense of our commonality, our common good, and of reason and toleration. And those things have never been easy, but we sure need to find them if this system is going to continue to operate.
You reminded me of a column you recently wrote, which is not in the collection, but that people have been saying to you, friends have been saying to you, what happened to you? And you said, nothing's happened to me. What's happened to you? Because you revisited your support for Obama, and you're still in that place. It's the country that's moved.
I mean, I infuriated the right because I supported Obama, because I thought he was the most moderate and sane person available to us. And the racial element could possibly be a wonderful development for helping us communicate better and integrate better. And I supported almost all of his policies. I have some issues with a couple of them, but basically. And now, a couple of years later, a few years later, I am a white supremacist. According to what? Because even though I oppose Trump, I am queasy about racial quotas. I'm queasy about accusing people of crimes publicly that you don't have the evidence for. I'm defensive about due process. I actually think there is something called biological sex. I think that the racial question is very complicated and can't be simply reduced to some malevolent single force called white supremacy, that it requires a much more serious and grown-up response. And yet I am now this crazy person. And my point was, you asked me what happened to me, what happened to you? I mean, where did this go? Where did you start? When did you start thinking it was okay to try and get another writer, however much you disagree with them, fired? When did you start to want to take down people for something that they had written 30 years ago? When did you start get this moralizing puritanical bug in which you had to destroy people you disagreed with? I mean, that's a sort of fanaticism that, I don't think anyone, and look, I don't mean to also just, if you watch Fox News, and I'm talking to mainly liberal audiences, so that's the point I make, but I am not in any way excusing the unbelievable slide towards irrationality, complete fantasy, paranoia, and delusion on the right.
Yeah.
I mean, that is, where I am. I've been dealing with the left fighting me and all the rest of it, and that happens.
You just reminded me of
never said anything but they are very dangerous. They are the most dangerous. Until until we have another election without Trump running, I think we're not in safe territory.
I want to get to questions, but you part of that answer just reminded me of your own self-description in your beautiful, moving open letter to your friend Ta-Nehisi Coates. You describe yourself as, "It seems to be in my nature, a querulous, insistent curiosity that sometimes relishes the hostility it often provokes." I love that. I wish that someone could apply it to me. So congratulations.
Yeah,
and I wanted to run by you this because we had an example of this here when we were talking about the newsrooms and media. The Inquirer wrote a headline that was offensive to many. It was stupid. It offended my headline writing viewpoints. The headline was "Buildings Matter Too," and the newsroom rose up and got the editor fired, who went on to become the editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And what I want to get your perspective on is the headline that replaced it, which was "Damaging buildings disproportionately hurt the people protesters are trying to uplift." To me, that's an example of what you're talking about.
Yes, we can be ridiculously sensitive at times, and one shouldn't write dumb headlines like "Buildings Matter Too," although I immediately knew what the point of that was. I mean, to be fair, as a headline, like, oh, they're saying it's the destruction of property is also matters, because that is people's livelihoods, it's their homes, it's the future of their lives. And there was a weird argument going around during some of those riots. I think Nicole Hannah-Jones made it, which is that, oh, buildings could be rebuilt, it doesn't really matter. They've got insurance. It's compared to the lives of people shot, you know? Well, it just also happens that, well, first of all, that's absurd. It's a semi-justification for the destruction of buildings. Secondly, you destroy buildings and neighborhoods and they deteriorate, and you have seen the crime rates in those places. It is costing Black lives. The destructiveness of some of that protest, not the legitimacy of the protest itself, but some of the rioting, looting, arson, destruction of property. Property and business is owned by African Americans as well as other people. So yeah, I think we can be too jump the gun. You know, writing especially, you know, it's hard to write well. It takes effort, it takes skill, and a certain amount of talent. But if you start out by saying, I can't say that, I can't say that, I can't say that, I can't say that, and I must be careful in saying that, you just become so constipated as a writer, you become so risk averse that you become boring, you lose your voice. Writers have got to have the ability to make mistakes, or else their writing will be drained of life. I mean, my old editor, Mike Kinsley, used to say, if you think you've gone too far, you probably haven't gone far enough. He also told me, for example, about some pieces, and this is when I was in my early 20s, write that piece now because you won't have the balls to write it in 20 years' time.
That's great.
And you know, one of those articles, the case for gay marriage in 1989. That's what he told you. Do that now. Because I made that argument at an editorial conference as a sort of debating point. I'm like, no, like, why wouldn't we? Blah, 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 blah. He's like, write that now. You think it's crazy, but you know, maybe not so crazy. And so that's how that happened. So again, if you don't allow the boundaries to be pushed and allow writers to have a certain amount of fallibility, I mean, it's just one error and people are gone. It's like, for God's sake, we're humans. We're going to make mistakes. We'll even make mistakes in tone. We may even occasionally say something quite disgraceful, and we should be called on it, but we shouldn't be immediately fired for the slightest imputation of it. What happens is that you fill up the ranks with apparatchiks who will never go too far, will know exactly the words to use. And you end up with the same tedious prose that you see now everywhere, in which, you know, every story is going to at some point relate to some structural oppression.
Well, you grew up in a large Irish Catholic family, right? The dinner was raucous debates, and that's like what civil society ought to be.
Well, I hope civil society has higher standards than my Irish Catholic family when we were growing up. But look, you couldn't see the other side of the room because the smoke was so thick, and people were yelling at each other about this and that. And occasionally someone would laugh, and someone occasionally would storm out or whatever. This is just all day long. So look, and I then was trained in the debating union at Oxford, which is sort of the whole idea. Look at the British House of Commons, and there they are. They're designed to be looking right at each other, so they hate each other right in the face. You can't duck it, you know. And they yell the most extraordinary things to one another. They say the most extraordinary things, even though they're all done in the polite parliamentary language. But you know what? There is a bar in the actual House of Commons itself. They don't even have to leave the chamber to have a drink with each other. And so what happens is you have this nice attitude in which people assail each other in the House, and then talk it out later over a couple of whiskeys. And that's a cultural achievement, you know. It's not easy. And there are many things that we kind of dismiss, like the civility required in the Congress or elsewhere. And, you know, it turns out those things kind of matter to sustain a civil debate. If you start out by saying you're a liar, where do you go? And that's why you're not allowed to say you're a liar in the House of Commons, because it kills debate. Yeah. And if you then say what you just said is irrelevant because you are a white male, or you are too old, or you're too young, or you are black, or then that also kills debate. You have to leave. And those are the rules that have been put in place now in this country, in the universities, and that affects the culture as a whole. Equally as, you know, the way cable news has gone to this hideous rival propaganda channels that help ratings. And even though at this point I know people are getting exhausted by it.
Yeah. Hey, Tia, do we have some questions from the virtual audience?
We do. Bill McClellan says, "Hi, Andrew. Thanks for hopping on today. How many books do you read per month, and any to recommend?"
Great question.
It is a good question. I read so much journalism that my time for books becomes a little difficult. But I've been, but I do try and read at least, I think maximum, I hate to say this, it's not that much, 4 or 5 books a month. That's all I could possibly cram in. Yeah, I'm reading the Woodward book right now. Just read a book on meritocracy by Adrian Wooldridge, which is really interesting. I'm about to read The Genetic Lottery by Catherine Page Harden, which is all about genetics and the environment and humans.
And you were surprised that the New Yorker just wrote a feature on her. Not
just a feature, but a kind of sympathetic feature.
Yeah.
That, well, at least that was not condemning her in the way that many others would. And given that the New Yorker has had such a very shrill tone over the last few years, certainly on questions this touchy, I thought it was a really a moment if people I'm mad at do better, I'm always happy to say, great. I think that's fantastic. I mean, and I think these other magazines are beginning to air some of that dissent.
Tia, any other questions? Anyone here have questions?
Yeah, we've got. Okay.
Go ahead.
Josh Middleton asks, Substack is a great medium for opinion-oriented writers, but how does reporting-driven journalism get funded if writers leave publications that have the resources to support it?
Well, that's a very good question. The truth is that Substack can't reproduce the kind of deep reportorial investment required, you know, put an investigative team on something for 6 months that turns out to be a dud, for example. That's a model that requires big money behind you and a certain amount of subsidy from our new Medicis, our Jeff Bezos or whoever is going to subsidize essentially these institutions. However, there is really good reporting going on Substack. People who have experience in reporting and people doing otherwise, who are breaking stories and who are interviewing people in the news, who are researching. You can go on Substack and look at the number of topics you can follow. You can follow finance, and these people are not just opining; they're giving you data. They're giving you information, and people will not. They subscribe to me. I hope because I'm not. They know I'm not reporting, but I will funnel reporting to them. But they know that. But they will. If they're subscribing to someone who's a reporter, they're going to want real reporting. And there's a huge incentive to do that. Now you multiply that a lot, and you could get a reporting ballast coming from Substack that would complement, if not entirely replace, the mainstream media as we now have it. So I don't think reporting is dead or impossible on Substack at all. I think you could do anything on Substack if people want you to. And I think of certain national security people who are doing reporting that is a little too deep for most of your general public, wouldn't get into the New York Times, or foreign reporting, which can be extremely helpful on Substack. There's a lot going on there. So I have hope about it. I think there's the more the merrier as far as I'm concerned.
That's great. We have a question from the live audience, and they gave me this throw microphone, so I'm going to throw it to our questioner and see if that works. Good catch.
Andrew, I caught the microphone. Can
you hear him?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Okay, great. First of all, I would pay a lot of money for you to blog again. So if you could do that, just let us know. I subscribed the first day to your new venture when I got the email from you. So I appreciate that. We're glad to have you back online. Violent crime is the biggest issue facing Philadelphians. 6 were shot yesterday in North Philadelphia. In this era of defund the police, what is the way forward?
Well, not to defund the police, first off. Look, I think we're seeing, we've yet to fully understand all of this, but we do know that some things did really help reduce crime. And there were these police task forces, really, that did the difficult work of preempting crime, of penetrating gangs, of aggressively finding people before crimes were committed. Now, these groups obviously are often in dangerous situations, and a disproportionate number of shootings took place in those groups, which rendered some of them, like happened in New York, disbanded in one day. And many cops, given the atmosphere, don't want to go back into those situations where they could help deter crime, but in the process might encounter someone armed and shoot and kill in ways that would ruin their entire lives, create huge embarrassment for the police department. And people, there's been a strategic recalculation of the risk people want to take. I think personally, I don't live in those neighborhoods, although in DC, I don't live that far away. And I used to, DC's gentrified, but I used to, and you could feel the crime in inner DC, the difference between the 1990s when I lived there and the 2010s, but it feels like it's coming back. My view is that policing is incredibly important. I think we're under-policing the inner city. I think we should be increasing number of cops in those places if we can. Now, we should also be thoroughly training them better to make sure we don't have these incidents and to make sure that they can communicate better. But I think the most progressive thing to do at this point is to double down on policing, aggressive policing in the inner city, to stop this gang-related warfare, which is spiraling out of control, which is killing children day in, day out. and rendering the possibility for anybody living in those areas to have a better life almost impossible. And so that's my view. I'm a pro law and order conservative in that respect. And I think that the quick symbolic virtue signaling of removing policing from places which desperately need it out of deference to liberal sensitivities, many sensitivities that are more widely held among white liberals than among Black moderates or even Black liberals, I think was a strategic error. I don't want it to obscure the necessity also of reforming the police and things like qualified immunity, for example, and ensuring that we have fewer of these shootings. But also, by the way, what interesting I found is that the number of actual police shootings has dropped considerably this year. So you're beginning to see the possibility that there's a trade-off here. If you aggressively police, you're going to have incidents occasionally in which people are going to get shot. And maybe some of them are innocent, and maybe some of them it shouldn't be done. But you may also get, if you don't do that, much higher rates of crime, which impacts everyone seriously. And I think the Democrats are incredibly complacent about this. People care about this issue, and they're going to vote that way.
Well, didn't Eric Adams's win in New York sort of bear that out? Are you encouraged by that?
Yes, extremely encouraged. I think he could help. But the trouble with this stuff is that once a dynamic takes place, a criminal dynamic takes place, you get a vicious cycle. It's very hard to reverse that, to get a virtuous cycle. We did have a virtuous cycle in the late 20th, early 21st century that was really a staggering success. And we've also, by the way, since in 20 years, reduced the number of police shootings dramatically. Again, no one talks about that. No one talks about the progress we made on that, even as we were reducing crime. That's the Goldilocks place, and we need to figure out how to get back to it.
Tia, is there one last question?
Oh, there are so many good questions that I feel bad.
Pick the best one.
Time for one. Let's see here. Okay. Dan Shapalavi says, are we really broken as people, really? Or are we always thus? The only elevation available to us really is that none of the mind elevated by wide-ranging education. No? Beyond that, it's really down to moral leadership, isn't it? Meaning, besides book learning, isn't it all down how we're led or how leadership informs how we build communities rather than us intrinsically?
Well, we all have our personal.
Sorry, last point. People haven't yet seen to have changed in thousands of years. That's it.
Well, that's true, obviously. Although actually we have actually constructed societies which have behaved differently, and we've helped educate and train people to behave differently towards one another in liberal societies. We just have. We don't snitch on each other. We try to obey the rules. We give each other the benefit of the doubt. We act as individual citizens reasoning the common good. These are practices that have not been very common in human history, that were the creation essentially of an American-European project since the 18th century, and which is incredibly precious. So precious that I think we really should be super vigilant when its procedures and methods and laws are violated, as well as when its spirit is violated. We have amazing First Amendment rights here, which means you can always tell someone, you may be fired, you may be intimidated, you may never want to write that paper, but you can still constitutionally do it. That misses the spirit of America. And the spirit is of freedom of speech almost absolutely, in a way that distinguishes between harm to a person's body and offense taken in their mind. And we have to be better at taking offense. We have to be better at making arguments. And And I think from the ground up, and I agree, it is leadership, it is parents, it is teachers. And that's what distresses me, when teachers are telling people some things you must never, ever say. When teachers tell people when they're kids, you know, you can be a boy or a girl, what do you feel like? These things are not helpful to sustaining a liberal society in which people feel free to ask difficult and often controversial questions.
Andrew, you spent so much time talking to us for this last hour about issues. I want to, your writing is often also very open and vulnerable on a personal level. And there's a beautiful piece on the death of your dog, Dusty, that made me tear up. And in fact, in it, you talk about your depression in 1997, and you were depressed for a fascinating reason. Can you tell us what that was about, and also tell us how you're doing now?
I had a clinical depression, in the late 90s, because when my viral load went to 0, in other words, when I found out for the first time that I wasn't going to die of HIV. And I know that sounds completely paradoxical. I should have had a bottle of champagne. I should have been thrilled and happy and relieved. I think actually the human psyche is more complicated than that. And I think once I knew I was in the clear, only then was I able to actually let myself feel what I had been going through for the previous decade, really, which was I'd been steeled against the deaths of my friends and the illnesses of my friends and my own possible mortality. And we were just fighting to get through this every day as young men. We were in our 20s. I nursed my own best friend to death. I lost 4 good friends and countless acquaintances. And I think once it was done, suddenly, what else was I going to do? What else mattered? And you felt lost. And I also felt very sad at missing them. And I eventually understood it was what they call survivor's guilt, which does not mean you feel guilty. You just mean obliterated by the loss of the people you loved and the inability to bring them back. And that's hard. I'm doing fine now, thank you. I had another, I hate to say this, I did have a clinical depression when Trump was elected afterwards. I had about 6 months in which it was very hard to function. It was a mix of other things too. But it really hit me hard. I think it hit a lot of us hard because it meant the America we thought we trusted maybe wasn't the America we knew. I'm praying that it was an America in a very strange mood. But again, I believe in this country. I'm an immigrant here, so I chose it, and I chose it for a reason. I chose it because for someone like me, it's an absolute paradise. They let you say whatever you want, you debate, you argue, you create, and the idea that would be stifled again is too depressing to contemplate. The idea that we become some sort of hideous authoritarian sort of presidential state, one Cordillo after another, just is too depressing for words. But anyway, you recover, you get up, you get going, you just put one foot in front of the other, and you have friends and loved ones, and you can get through anything. But it's hard. It's hard sometimes. Depression is difficult, and my family's subject to it to some extent, and I get it every now and again.
Well, we love you here in Philly. This is Sullivan Country.
Thank you.
If you can visit, we will do shots of Jameson, just like after raucous debates.
In my case, it's always Jägermeister. I'm a Jägermeister. I know that's disgusting. I know people think it's absolutely disgusting, but I like it. I dated a frat boy once, and he introduced me to it, and I kind of got hooked on it.
That's awesome. That's it. Jägermeister party with Sullivan. Next time we can get him here.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much for arranging this. And again, I'm sorry to not be there in person.
No problem. We love you.
All right.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.